I'm Phil Hellmuth Jr. How many times have you heard someone say that you don't need cards to win a pot? The fact is, they're right. Play the player, not the cards. Son, in Hold'em, there are going to be plenty of times that you're going to flop air, meaning that your hand doesn't connect with the flop in any way, shape, or form. And while this isn't as good as flopping a monster, yeah, no kidding, it's not always unprofitable, especially if you're in position. In our earlier lessons, we talked about the importance of raising pre-flop and of playing more pots from position than out of position. Now we're going to show you how these strategies can pay off when you flop nothing but air. Remember, by raising pre-flop, you're taking the lead and you're telling your opponents you have a strong hand. Since most players will tend to check to the raiser after the flop, you can now use your position to reinforce this message, I'm strong, by betting out or continuation betting, even if you have nothing. C-bets, baby! Why does this work? Because you're not changing the story you started before the flop. By raising before the flop, you represented strength, and by betting after the flop, after your opponent checks to you, you're telling them that your hand is still strong, that it's still good, or at least it's better than their hand is. To make the continuation bet work, you should make it about 50 to 60% of the size of the pot. This bet size is large enough to represent that you have a good hand, but not so large that you have to win every time in order for the play to be profitable. Consider the single opponent will miss the board about 2/3 of the time, and most of these times he will check fold to a continuation bet. C-bet! Because your bet size is relatively small in relation to the pot, this means you will be successful approximately 60% of the time when you only need to win about 40% of the time to make money, to be profitable. Now, let's say you raise before the flop and your opponent takes the lead by betting into you on the flop. While this may seem scary, the fact is they probably don't have much. This play is often called a weak lead because your opponent likely caught a small piece of the flop and is betting for information. In this case, you can often just float your opponent by calling on the flop. Floating, baby, that means to call with nothing at all just to try to bluff on the turn. Or you call with nothing on the turn just to try to bluff on the river. In any case, if they now check the turn after you float it on the flop, which they usually will, you can often provoke them to fold by retaking the lead and betting out. Don't try this play at home, and don't try it every time, because if you attempt it too often, talented opponents will realize you're probably stealing a fair number of pots and will likely call you down even if they just have a small pair. By the way, the float bet, it's been very hot. 2009, 2010, 2008, there's all these sites devoted just to the float bet. So, an old school way, I wouldn't necessarily float. I'd just raise it if I thought my opponent had nothing. They float, which, it does provide the advantage of if they miss their draw. I mean, if you re-raise on the flop, they may move in with a draw. But if you now bet on the turn instead, you may force them to fold. Any case, let's get back to the topic. When you see someone who likes to bet for information on the flop, calling and betting with weak leads, after they check the turn, can often be effective because you have given them the information that they were looking for. Their hand is no good. You can also float with air. Float with air. I love it. When you're in position and a pre-flop raiser bets the flop, where else can you say you can float with air, baby? Since there's a strong chance they are continuation betting themselves, your call on the flop or the turn will likely scare them and force them to check, at which point you can then make a bet and win the pot. Again, be careful about this because, when you're going to try to do a lot of floating, and especially against tricky or really good opponents, they're going to figure out what's happening. So I would use the float bet more often against weak opponents who are likely to fold under pressure. Finally, let me give you one last word of caution about flopping air in position. If your head's up and the pre-flop raiser checks the flop to you, don't be too quick to try and steal the pot. In this spot, it's likely that your opponent has a big hand, and he's trying to trap you by check calling or check raising. I mean, why else would he lead before the flop? Would he raise before the flop and then just check to you? Instead, don't be afraid when someone raises before the flop and now they check the flop. Don't be afraid to check behind them and keep the pot small if you have a strong hand.